time, as much as I would love for us to actually go around and introduce ourselves, speaking, I think I'm just going to have people use the chat to say who you are. Hi, Paloma. Hi, Dave. Hi, everybody. My mom is here. I'm at my mom's house, Nancy Bear. Use the chat as able and willing to say who you are in whatever degree of complexity works for you, and as much complexity as you want to share about what that means to you, who you are, where you are, and why you are here. So we'll do that in the chat. Yes, Dave is very complex, but tell us who you are, Dave. Loretta knows, those of you who are doing capstones, I shared with Loretta your projects. So she knows your interests, at least in some detail. And I should also mention that the strategic communication folks will be doing individual projects as well. So that might be something that if you're in 606, you can put in the chat, talk about the organization you're going to be working for. And I sent ahead materials about Loretta and who she is, and I've been raving about her for a long time, so I'd be surprised at this point. Hi, Gina, one of our guests here on camera. Gina is not a USF person, but she is a friend of mine. And she has some folks here working with her. Kate Smith, you're here too. Excellent. Okay, I'm just saying lots of highs. There's Kate Smith. But mainly I just want Loretta to introduce herself. And I think that, you know, I told you who we are, and you're a master communicator. And that's one of the reasons we want to hear from you. But another thing I just want to make sure it's clear is that, you know, our program has a lot of ideological and political diversity, but we're also at a Jesuit institution. We share a lot of values. We have a shared commitment to service. And I think it's absolutely okay to say we all share a commitment to a safer, healthier, and more just country for all the human beings who live here. And we know that it's going to take all of us working together to achieve it. And that's a culture we very much try to build here. So that's my preamble. But Loretta, if you would just tell us who you are, what you're up to these days, and talk with us, and I will monitor the chat and feed questions. And I think we probably will have max 15, 20 people tonight. It shouldn't be huge.
Okay. Well, it's great to be with y'all this evening. My name is Loretta Ross. I've been a social justice activist for more than 50 years. Currently, I'm an associate professor at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. I just started teaching 5 years ago after doing a lot of social justice work. I think they call me a clinical professor, which means that I come to the classroom and teach what I learned in community. Basically, that's a fancy word for sharing the knowledge that I've earned, I hope, from becoming an activist at 16, and now I'm 68. So I've been doing it a long, long time. I have several key interests. The course that I teach at Smith is called White Supremacy in the Age of Trump. Since I am teaching at a predominantly white institution, I find that I get about 50 students a semester who are desperately eager to find out why this knowledge was not taught to them before they got to college. They are really upset, even if they came from private schools, homeschooling, or public schools, how the only thing they know about white supremacy is Martin Luther King's birthday and Rosa Parks, basically. And I try to teach them the difference between white supremacy as an ideology and whiteness as an identity, because anybody can be ideologically aligned with the white supremacist movement. Matter of fact, a number of white supremacists are not even white, and certainly not all white people are white supremacists. And so I try to teach them about the ideology of white supremacy and what impact it has on our society today. Another key interest of mine is reproductive justice. I became a teen mother at age 15 through incest back in the 1960s, which is not the best way to become a mother, as you can imagine. I had no choice over whether I would have sex or whether I would have that baby. The only choice I had was whether to keep him or give him up for adoption. And by making the decision to keep my son, I ended up co-parenting with my rapist, who was a cousin of mine, married, 27 years old when I was 14. And so that's probably the most complicated parenting situation one can imagine. A few years later, I was sterilized at age 23. And so that led me to working on reproductive justice issues. And in 1994, I was fortunate enough to be with 11 other Black women who co-created the concept of reproductive justice, which has become the dominant framework for talking about reproductive politics in this country, because all of us were working, or at least tangential to, the reproductive health rights movement. We aligned ourselves with the pro-choice wing of the movement, fighting for the right not to have a child. But because we were Black women, always subjected to strategies of population control and eugenical thinking, we fought equally as hard for the right to have the children that we wanted to have and the conditions under which we wanted to have children, which of course includes using doulas, midwives, resisting unnecessary medical interventions like cesarean sections and things like that. And then the third tenet of reproductive justice is the one that I think is the most inclusive and capacious, because it is the fight for the right to raise the children in safe and healthy environments. And neither the pro-life nor the pro-choice side, in our opinion, paid enough attention to what happened to the baby once the baby was born. And so that brings us into conversation with things like gun violence and school to prison pipelines and environmental issues and the underfunding of schools because of tax policies and food deserts, health deserts, all those kinds of things. And so that is my second most captivating subject that I'm fond of. I've co-written 3 books on reproductive justice, including the first one ever in 2004. And for the last 5 years, 6 years maybe, I've been writing a book and studying the concept of calling in the calling out culture, because I believe that too much damage, too much harm is being done in the name of accountability. But it's become a system of hurt people hurting others worse kind of thing, rather than seeking a way to cross our emotional, political, and identity divides as a way to solve our problems together. And so those are my 3 major pockets of interest. Underlying all of these apparently disparate subjects, white supremacy, reproductive justice, and calling in, is a belief in the human rights framework. I bow to the wisdom of my ancestors, from Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King to Malcolm X to Audre Lorde to June Jordan to Tony K. Bambara. They've all demanded that we build a US-based human rights movement to hold the United States accountable for its human rights violations domestically and internationally. And so I am proud to say that I am intentionally part of that human rights movement. And I get challenged on that a lot because most people don't believe in the human rights framework, largely because they haven't received a good human rights education about it. When you say human rights, they think of the tortured prisoner in a jail overseas somewhere, and they don't see how that's applicable to the United States and what's going on in this country. And so in 1996, I founded the National Center for Human Rights Education as a way to teach people what their human rights are. And I'm proud to say that my co-founders were as diverse as you could possibly be, because I keep saying that there was a Muslim, a Christian, a Jew, and an atheist who came together to teach human rights to the American public. And we succeeded, because over a 10-year period, we distributed over 1 million copies of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and trained millions of people in how to use the human rights framework in leveraging for us to be connected to this global justice framework rather than labor endlessly under the limits of the US constitutional system, which of course we just saw how limited it was with the recent Roe decision. And so that's a little brief introduction of my life. Kelly, where would you like me to take my next comments? Is it on calling in, on
Wow.
justice, on human rights, white supremacy?
I
And
mean,
I got 1 or 2 other interests called tennis and pinochle, but I'm not sure if you want to hear about either of those things.
it would be very fun to get together and play pinochle, but maybe not tonight. No tennis for me. So, I mean, so many directions, right? So I would probably say start with calling in, only because I wrote down, you named 3 kinds of divides: emotional, political, and identity. I haven't necessarily always seen people cut it so finely, because we talk a lot about how can we talk better to each other here in this group. So maybe start a little bit with calling in for us. And we could go any number of directions, but I would start there.
Okay. Well, I started investigating the call out culture accidentally, as a matter of fact. That son that I had in high school gifted me with a grandson, but my grandson, when he was about 12 years old, apparently didn't know how to answer his phone from his grandmother. And he told me to get on Facebook to contact him. And the minute I got on Facebook, he migrated off talking about it was for old folks. I was like, okay, kid. So he went somewhere else, maybe Instagram or TikTok. I don't know where he went. But I stayed on Facebook, and once I did, I found out how unbelievably mean people were to each other over social media. And I became convinced that people took the liberty to say things anonymously to each other that they didn't have the courage to say in real life or face to face. And so I asked another young person I was working with what was going on. And she said, "Oh, you mean the call out?" And I was surprised. I said, "Y'all named it?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, what are y'all doing about it?" And she shrugged her shoulders and walked away as if it was inevitable. And I started processing by that time my 45 years of activism. When I was the director of the first rape crisis center in this country, I learned how to talk to men who were incarcerated for raping and murdering women, because I wanted to understand how to end rape beyond just bandaging up the victims. In the 1990s, I worked at the National Anti-Klan Network, which was renamed the Center for Democratic Renewal. And my job became to deprogram white supremacists who had already left the movement. I can't claim that I helped them leave the movement, but once they did, I became their handler to help them reintegrate into normal society, or at least a society that's not white supremacist. And I found unexpectedly in myself a capacity for having conversations with the most unlikely people. These were not people I would bring home for coffee, but they were human beings that I could no longer hate once I got to know them. And then by being in a predominantly white women's movement, I've always had to figure out the difference between an actual enemy and a problematic ally. And so I thought that my experience in those ways had something to contribute to the concept of calling in. What if we call each other in instead of calling each other out? Since then, I started this work. I've conceptualized what I call the 5C continuum. Calling out, I think we all recognize, because that is demanding that people be held accountable in a very public and shaming way for something that we think they've done wrong. Now, it is important to point out that it's usually very public, and it's designed to produce shame, because obviously you could call somebody in privately if you think they need correction. But the fact that you've chosen to do it publicly, whether through social media or in person or in writing or something like that, means that you're inviting them into a fight, not a correction. Because any human being who's publicly shamed that way is going to have a freeze, fight, or flight reaction. They're not going to want to, quote, listen to what someone who's just shamed them wants to say. So calling out is the first C. The ultimate call out is canceling somebody. When you not only think they should be held accountable for something you think they've done or said or believed wrong, but you want them to be punished for it. And that punishment means losing their job, losing their platform, or at least losing their reputation. And so, unfortunately, people not operating in good faith have called it all the cancel culture, as if it's a runaway train, and they try to say that anytime somebody says something that they don't disagree with, that they're being canceled. And they're not operating in good faith when they use that kind of allegation, because there was a time when the call out cancel culture was the privilege of only the rich and powerful. And they usually punched down on people who were vulnerable, who couldn't punch back. And the only reason it's coming up for criticism now is because the previous victims can use a keyboard and punch back. Yeah, and so they don't like the democratization of the call out cancel culture. And that's why you see them whining all the time about it. Calling in is along that continuum. That's the fifth C. And a calling in is really just a call out done with love and respect. And so instead of using anger, blaming, and shaming as your strategy or tactic, whichever one you want to call it, you're choosing to lead with love and respect. When you do that, you're actually inviting people into a conversation instead of a fight. And a classic calling in tactic would be, that's an interesting perspective you just shared. Could you tell me more? It's that you're inviting them into a conversation. By inviting them into a conversation, you haven't signaled that you agree with them, but you have signaled that you respect their right to have an opinion that may be different from yours, and you want to hear what is the basis for their opinion. Because every human being has a set of lived experiences that guides what our opinions are. And it's an invitation to hear their story like you hope somebody wants to hear yours. Calling on is a concept that was created by the writer Sonia Renee Taylor. And she said that she doesn't like to use calling out or calling in as her strategy of choice, because both of those require an investment of time and attention in another person, and you don't know if they deserve it or not. And so she calls on people to do better. It's kind of like that intermediate step. And so she'll say her favorite calling on statement might be, somebody says something to you that doesn't land right. And instead of reacting to it by calling it in or calling it out, she'll just respond and say, I beg your pardon. and just let that lay there. And quite often the person will walk back their comments because they didn't land as they wanted them to. And that gives a person an opportunity to interrogate whether their inner good opinion of themselves aligns with those words that just came out of their mouth, kind of thing. And she says if they respond positively to being called on, then chances are I'm going to call them in. But if they respond negatively to having attention called to their words, then I'm going to call them out. So it's part of her decision tree, how she makes it. And so the fifth C that I use is one we all should use more often. It's called calling it off. We have no obligation to engage in non-productive conversations with people who are not operating in good faith, who are willing to lie, who are willing to engage in personal or ad hominem attacks, who have their own separate set of facts and they don't want to necessarily admit that their facts are really opinions, kind of thing. And so whether it's in real life or over social media, I suggest people make more use of calling it off. And you can call it off temporarily by saying, you know, I'm just not in the headspace to continue this conversation right now. Can we get back together later? Or you can call it off permanently and say, I will never have the time or the desire to continue this non-productive conversation with you again. Let us change subjects. Quite often we use that tactic when it comes to politics or religion with people who are in our lives, but we know having those conversations with them are non-productive. So we just tend to silently call it off and change subjects, kind of thing. So that's the 5C continuum. I teach the techniques of calling in, calling out, calling on, and calling it off on my in my online classes. The next conversation we're going to have is scheduled for July 26th. And you can look up on my website, LorettaJRoss.com, if you'd like to join these conversations. All of our conversations, as well as our classes, are only $5 per session. So you get to sign up for as many as you want or not, kind of thing. And the topic of the July 26th conversation will be defining harm, because I believe there's too frequently an overstatement of harm, when really it's about people disagreeing with you. But that doesn't mean that they're going to pin you down and rape you or violate you or physically assault you. But right now, the word harm, like the word trigger, is so overused that it ends up escalating minor problems into big nuclear conflicts. And it is cutting off people's ability to communicate effectively with each other, because it requires a lot of word policing, tone policing, reinterpretation. I mean, right now, there's a whole debate, for example, in our society taking place over the use of the word woman. And I was in a presentation when I was talking about the history of reproductive justice and how 12 Black women created it. And one of my audience members came up in the Q&A and told me just the use of the word woman was causing them harm. You know, and I'm like, yeah. Would you like to come to my calling in class? You know, because obviously that's an overstatement of harm if I ever heard one, kind of thing. And so.
Yeah, and just sorry to interrupt, but Elle's asking in the chat, how did she say why, or how did she elaborate? It was at the end of the conversation. What happened next?
No, they went into a 20-minute tirade about how the word woman was trans erasure. and did not include people who did not like or apply the word woman to themselves. And because we were talking about Roe and the abortion decision, it was very appropriate, I thought, to talk about the women who were impacted by that decision, as well as anybody else capable of getting pregnant. And so apparently they would have preferred me to just stick to anybody capable of getting pregnant rather than the use of the word woman. But one thing I've learned about oppression is that when you can't name its targets, you can't name its solution. Because that de-victimizes the victim.
Right.
And that works the same way that color blindness works to obscure white supremacist racism. And so it was a 20-minute tirade where I had to call myself in, not to call that person out, because I was there as an invited speaker, not as a debater with someone who obviously is very hurt and is willing to hurt a lot of other people because of that.
Right. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but again, when we were talking about divides, the first thing that came out was emotional. Clearly this person needs to talk to somebody about this, but maybe not you in that moment, but what is our response? Like, is there anything that can be done as a culture or, because that person's energy would be of great use to the movement, right? If redirected.
But until that person becomes more used to themselves, they won't be of any use to the movement, because the movement is not a personal therapy space. The purpose of the human rights movement is to end oppression, not to fix its participants. Too many people bring their fragility to the human rights movement and get alienated and disappointed when we can't make their agenda our agenda. Their agenda of healing is not our agenda. And I think some people need therapists instead of typewriters or keyboards.
Yes.
Because they are bringing a lot of trauma into our social justice and human rights spaces, and they're trying to make their trauma the central issue that we work on. And that is not the purpose of people coming together. Right. It is traumatized people who are most drawn to the human rights movement. So we can spend all our days working on each other's trauma or working on stopping those things that traumatize us. And we choose to work on stopping those things that traumatize us rather than individually work on each person's trauma.
Well put. So is this a good moment to segue then to, the human rights piece of this? And because a lot of people in the room are coming at this from different angles, looking to do work for different causes. Arguably, all of it could fit into a human rights framework one way or another. And I know people will have questions, but, back to your big buckets. And I'd love to talk about white supremacy culture as well. But maybe let's talk about how we can all get smarter about human rights and think about things through a human rights, to your point. Like, I think it's not what we're teaching my elementary school children, as we should, like, I love that I actually did not know, I am pretty good on your biography, but I didn't know that about the center you started. Can you tell us about that? And can you tell me, I guess, how to center human rights?
Well, there were two particular things that led me to learning more about the human rights movement. The first was the International Conference on Population and Development, which happened 3 months after we had created the reproductive justice framework. And there we learned that women from the global South were using the human rights framework to demand the same entitlements that we were trying to use the limited US Constitution to achieve. And so I learned from women in the global South about the flexibility, the inclusiveness, the interrelated this and the universality of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, of course, that wasn't the first time I'd heard the phrase, but like most people, like I said, it was just a tortured prisoner in a jail somewhere. I hadn't really thought about its applicability to the work that I was doing. Then in 1995, a year later, the Murrah building in Oklahoma was blown up by white supremacists, and by Timothy McVeigh in particular. But I don't think he ever acted alone. I don't care what the government says. Anyway, part of my job was to deprogram, as I said, white people who had left the white supremacist movement. And one guy who had been deeply affected by the Oklahoma City bombing was named Floyd Cochran. And he'd been the national spokesman for the Aryan Nations in Hayden Lake, Idaho. Well, Floyd's second son was born with a cleft palate. And so his Nazi buddies told him that his son was a genetic defect that needed to be culled. And so Floyd, quite logically and rationally, left the Aryan Nations because his child was at risk. And once he left, though, and he became mine to work with, Floyd asked a very important question. He said, Loretta, you know I'm a great leader. I've studied the Bible back and forth. I've been the chief recruiter of skinheads for the last 10 years. And for 20 years, I've been a Nazi. Where's the movement I can join now? And he stumped me with that question because I first started mumbling, well, maybe you could join the civil rights movement. And he was like, you think they're ready for an ex-Nazi? And I had to say, probably not, because I can imagine Floyd in the face of, Black people who have been harmed by hate violence just welcoming him in. And I said, and you certainly can't join the women's movement because I happen to know you're still sleeping around on your wife. I mean, you're not the most upright person. Even if you renounce Nazism, that doesn't make you the most upright person. So I took Floyd's question to my boss at the time, who was Reverend C.T. Vivian, who had been the aide to Dr. Martin Luther King, his chief organizer. And it was C.T. who pulled a book off of his library shelf and showed me Dr. King's last Sunday sermon, March 31st, 1968, where he called on us to build a human rights movement. And 4 days later, he was assassinated. And I blurted out so disrespectfully, I really didn't need to blurt it out. I said, well, wait a moment. Everybody told me he had a dream. Nobody told me he had a plan. That we were supposed to be building a human rights movement. And he said, yeah, because that plan got killed with his assassination. And so Reverend Vivian helped me build the next year the National Center for Human Rights Education, along with the Muslim scholar Abdullahi al-Nahim, Shulamith Kernick, who was an Israeli American who fought on behalf of the Palestinians in Israel, and then me. And so we founded the National Center for Human Rights Education and spent the next decade educating social justice activists in this country about the necessity of building a human rights movement and the process. Because, like, as a feminist, I consider myself part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement. But I also care about racial justice, so I'm part of the civil rights wing of the human rights movement. I'm disabled, so I care about disability rights and human rights. So whatever issue you care about, you could define it as belonging to the human rights framework and the human rights movement. But the key point you have to remember is that once you subscribe to the human rights framework and join the movement, then you have to be careful not to do the work you focus on in a way that violates the human rights of other parts of your movement. So you can't work on violence against women in a racist way, or you can't work on trans rights in a misogynist way, or you can't work on women's rights in an anti-immigrant way or a racist way or those kinds of things. You can't work on disability rights in a way that excludes people, that kind of thing. And so I firmly believe that what I'm teaching and others are teaching about calling in will be as important to the human rights movement in the 21st century, a way that we do our work, as nonviolence was to the civil rights movement in the 20th century. A statement of our values contained in the way that we do our work. And so one of the things I learned was all the categories of human rights. I didn't know that there were categories of human rights. Currently, there are 8 categories of human rights protections to which we are all entitled. You know, we're entitled to civil rights, the right to be free from discrimination, our political rights, freedom of speech, or freedom of assembly, uh, economic rights, the right to make a living wage so that we don't suffer, or the right to form a trade union, or those kinds of rights. Um, Social rights, the right to have our human needs met, be they need for education, healthcare, food, shelter, clothing, medical care, support when we can't take care of ourselves, like welfare or Social Security or unemployment. Cultural human rights, which are the right to practice the culture of our church that we choose, like freedom of religion, is a human right. But freedom from having other people's religion imposed upon you is also a human right, for example. Environmental human rights, the right to clean drinking water, the right to live in safe neighborhoods free of environmental contaminants. Climate change is a human rights issue, for example. Developmental human rights, those are the rights for each community or country to develop their own natural resources and not have them stolen by other people's armies or corporations. And probably every war the United States has been in since World War II has been a war of developmental human rights, because we can't explain how our oil keeps getting under their sand. So we always invade them and try to topple the governments and take their oil. Like God made some big geological boo-boo that our military has to correct. And then sexual human rights, the right to determine if and when you'll marry, if and when you'll have children, the right to sexual pleasure, the right to body autonomy, gender identity. And that last category, sexual human rights, became so attractive to the LGBTQ movement that they started reframing their work as a sexual human rights movement, which I'm okay with to a point. But the point that I don't agree with is that I don't want the LGBT movement to settle for only one set of human rights, like Black people did with civil rights. I want all the human rights for everybody, and then there is a ninth category of human rights that is emerging, and I think it's going to be called digital human rights, because quite quickly it's becoming apparent that if you're not digitally connected, that you will not enjoy all the other human rights. You won't be able to access education or healthcare or credit or a whole lot of other things necessary to live a life of human dignity. And so all these categories of human rights have been achieved by social movements demanding them. They're not manna from governments or the United Nations. These are hard fought human rights that different social movements have demanded. And that's what we have to continue to do. And so, and by the way, let me just explain how even the concept of human rights landed at the United Nations, because it's, the United Nations didn't create the concept of human rights. I mean, Frederick Douglass spoke about human rights in 1858 to protest the lynching of a Black man in New York City, 90 years before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written. But after World War II, and specifically after the Holocaust against Jews, Gypsies, and anybody Nazi Germany didn't like, the world community through the United Nations recognized that there was not a set of laws that prohibited a Holocaust. Just like there wasn't a set of laws that prohibited the United States from wiping out indigenous people. There are many immoral acts that government legalized. And so they wrote, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt formed a committee in 1946, and they spent 2 years combing through every religious tradition, every political tradition, every ancient philosophy they could come up with, and presented the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for approval by the United Nations. And it did so on December 10th, 1948, which is why December 10th is Human Rights Day. And then the United States actually urged, and I might even say bullied, every country in the world except the Soviet Union into signing it, and then quickly abandoned it because the conservatives within our country were concerned that if they actually implemented the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it would demand that they end Jim Crow segregation. As a matter of fact, Alan Foster Dulles, for whom Dulles Airport is named after in Washington, D.C., he wrote a memo to the president saying that we need to be cautious about this human rights thing because we don't want our Negroes to get agitated. And so quite quickly, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights became distorted, politicized, and largely abandoned by the United States because it was seen as a communist plot trying to impose global standards and invade the sovereignty of the United States. And that's what is currently still said about it by those who are opposed to human rights. And that's why we don't have every developed country, every country in the global north has some form of human rights education in the school system, except the United States. And so we're the world's worst performer when it comes to upholding the UDHR. And that's why we got kicked off the Human Rights Council by the European Union and Canada, because they were the two bodies that voted on whether we could stay on the Human Rights Council. And since the United States has only ratified 3 of 26 human rights treaties, they're like, we can't have you representing us because you do not support the fullness of human rights the way we need you to. And of course, our media got that all backwards because they said, well, why would the United States be kicked off of a Human Rights Council when Cuba's allowed to remain? But it's Latin America that votes on Cuba. It's Canada and the EU that votes on the United States. You know, and so Cuba being on the council had nothing to do with the United States staying on it.
Right.
Anyway, I find the UDHR, the Human Rights Framework, very useful. And I almost never fail to tell people about all the categories whenever I give a speech, because even in that tiny way, I feel I've shared something with people that they should have known all their lives. I mean, I never know what people are going to do when I do human rights education, but I analogize it to teaching slaves to read. I don't know what they're going to do with the knowledge, but I'm damn glad they have it, kind of thing. And so human rights education is what I do, but it undergirds what I care about.
Right. And maybe this is a good time. There are a couple questions in the chat and I want people to raise their hands and ask them in a minute, but let's circle back if you think it's appropriate to the first idea we talked about, which I think might be relative to the United States and human rights or relevant, pardon me, but I want your take. Tell us about white supremacy ideology.
Well, I mean, white supremacy is not hard to define either. It's that belief that a certain race of people, and we have to realize that the whole concept of racial categories is bunk anyway. I mean, it's scientifically disproven. But just because they made it up doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. White supremacy actually originated on the Iberian Peninsula back in the 1100s. A lot of people think that it was only created in the 1619 when the first kidnapped slaves were brought over here. That's not true. What had happened was that Spain and Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula had been in a number of wars, mostly with Portugal being the aggressor, because Spain, because it had been invaded by the Moors, enjoyed great trade relationships with Africa. They monopolized the trans-Saharan trade routes. And so Spain got rich from bringing spices, gold, and diamonds, and all kinds of things from Africa to Europe. And Portugal was jealous of this, and so they went to war a couple of times trying to topple Spain, but to no avail. So the King of Portugal decided to send a ship westward to see if they could find or discover another trade route with Africa that could bypass Spain. What they discovered instead was all these African kingdoms on the west coast of Africa that were undefended from invasions by the sea, because all the fortifications they had built were turned towards the interior because of tribal conflicts from the interior. And so after they kidnapped a few Black people or Africans and stole quite a bit of gold from what was then called the Gold Coast, they brought this news back to the King of Portugal, and the King of Portugal decided to turn what had been a trade relationship with Africa to a piracy and plunder relationship with Africa. And it was in that context that one's religion became attached to one's racial identification. They identified Jewish people as being not a separate religion, but a separate race of people. There have been pogroms against Jews throughout Europe, starting in the 700s. They reinvented Africans as beasts instead of trade partners and humans who couldn't properly take care of their own natural resources. So it took Portugal to come in there and show them what to actually do with diamonds and gold and slaves and stuff like that. And so you had the weaponization of religion to serve economic interests, and the racialization of people so that a hierarchy could be established to describe who deserved to use the wealth of Africa and who didn't. And we had a grave growth of anti-Semitism at the time, because one of the other reasons that anti-Semitism was so popular, I guess that's the word, back then, was Europe generally had to borrow from Jewish bankers the money to prosecute its wars. But if you define the people you owe money to as subhuman, then you no longer have to pay back that money, do you? So then you started seeing a lot of descriptions, because on the Iberian Peninsula you had Muslim, Jews, and Christians all kind of coexisting, intermingling, intermarrying, all kinds of stuff. But after that relationship with Africa was changed, then the politics, the religions changed because the economic relations were changed and stuff. And so you have to look at economic relations to understand the growth of white supremacy. Now, the term white had not yet been created, the concept of a white race, but it wasn't long after. By the time Columbus sailed for the West, whiteness was associated indelibly with Christianity. Paganism, barbarianism was indelibly associated with Muslims and Africans, and Jews were just seen as the white other who could threaten the real Christians, kind of thing. And a lot of people don't even know that it was like, I think it was in the 800s that Jews were forced to wear the yellow Star of David because they were phenotypically indistinguishable from white people. And they needed to know who was Jewish and who was Christian. And of course, sometimes we were taught about the Spanish Inquisition and the forcible conversion of Jews into Christianity and all of that. All of that was born out of economic decisions that people made in order to dominate the world's resources. So by the time, the colonization of the New World took place, there was the doctrine of discovery, the whole talking about white Christians being the true dominionists over the planet and everybody else on it and all of that. So that lent itself to what we saw as the British codes or the English codes being adopted in the United States. And I should also add, there was the invasion and colonization of Ireland and Scotland that had happened on the English, within the Great Britain island nations. And so that also caught into it because the Black codes that were created for the Irish were the ones that were best adapted to set up a distinct set of laws dealing with kidnapped Africans and indentured servants and stuff like that. I'm sorry, I went polemical on you. Probably provided more information than you ever wanted.
No, it's wonderful. And bring it into today if you can, or,
I mean, that's why we're fighting this white Christian nationalism to this day. With people who don't believe there should be a separation between church and state, that somehow that it is the obligation of certain people of certain religions to rule over and dominate everybody else. It's almost read as a spiritual calling to do that. And then if you reduce the people you want to dominate to subhuman status, then you don't even have to be accountable for things like murder because you just cold beasts. You have not actually taken the life of another human being. So, I gave you probably the Cliff Notes version of a complicated thing. But.
No, that's perfect. Kate has her hand up. Kate.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So I have a question about the calling in technique. If someone offends in a public forum and I take the time to talk to them, calling them in, how does that impact all of the other people that were in the public forum who were likewise as offended?
If the calling out is public, I tend to have what I call my 3-step response. The first step, believe it or not, is that I say thank you. And the reason I am sincerely thanking them is that it's just possible that they have called my attention to something that I was unaware of. And they gifted me with something that is a hot commodity today, their time and attention. You know how much Facebook pays for our time and attention? I mean, we're in the attention economy right now. So you can say with all sincerity, thank you as your first step. The second step is to indicate that you've heard them. And so I would say, thank you for bringing that to my attention, and I will take it into consideration. If you say something like that, you've acknowledged that you've heard them, but you've not agreed that they're right. You said that I'm gonna decide about what you said in my own time. But I can acknowledge that you said it. And then the third step is to turn the calling out into a calling in. And that is to say, thank you, I will take this under consideration. And by the way, I'm pretty sure you could have gotten my attention in a number of ways other than the one you chose. So are you okay? What's going on with you? Because I care much about you as I do about myself. So you then made the person and the audience that witnessed all of this understand that that person chose to call you out. They actually had other choices, and maybe the choice they selected was driven by what was going on with them versus what you've done. Remember, I started off talking about hurt people hurting people kind of thing. And so with that 3 step, you can handle almost any calling out, because you don't have to acknowledge whether a person was right, to acknowledge that you've heard them and you will consider what they've said. But you can also demonstrate your ability to love and respect, even in the midst of a call out, the other person by asking if they're okay and why did they choose that way to get your attention. When you model that to a larger group, then people realize that, oh, I don't have to get defensive. I don't have to get shut down. I don't have to, accept this invitation to a fight. I can actually handle this, because the fact that someone called you out says more about what's going on with them than you. So you don't have to accept their opinion of you until you've had a chance to consider it. Sometimes you are wrong, but you get to consider that in your own time and place, not at their beck and call. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
1, 2, 3. Thank them, say I consider it, and ask them about themselves.
Leandro has a question, but can I do a quick follow-up to that? Just because I can imagine, well, it takes a lot of strength and presence and grounding to do that, I imagine, right? I mean, so how do you get yourself ready for these kinds of things? Does it get easier over time? We're in a public leadership program. We're working on stepping out and into public dialogues. And obviously, or maybe not obviously, but the implication is we should make sure we're ready to do this, right? But I can see.
But that's part of it. Part of getting yourself ready is that internal self-assessment. Are you in a sufficiently healed enough place to be able to build a container for someone who calls you out? If you're not, then you can call it off. You can walk away. You can say, I don't agree, and walk away. There's a number of things you can do. But if you have done that internal temperature check, if you say, okay, I hear this person and I want to continue this conversation that I might learn something in, then that's when you do the calling in. But I have to honestly say, this stuff ain't easy. I call myself in 100 times a day because I love cussing people out. I love it. I am the call out queen. And so I'm constantly calling myself in before I even try it on somebody. Like when that young girl, obviously 50 years younger than me, thought that she was going to admonish me for using the word woman. Of course, I wanted to react defensively to her and call her out, and but I found that I have so much power that I reduce people to blithering idiots without meaning to do so. And so I have to be very careful when I use my power and my words against people. I don't mind fucking somebody up on purpose. I don't like doing it accidentally. You know, so I want to make sure that how I respond, I try to be very, so that means I have to call myself in so that I don't accidentally blow up somebody. By the way, I've done bad call outs and they still haunt me. When I didn't, when I lost sight of the person that I was talking to because I was too caught up in my own pain, I found I didn't like myself after I did that. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah. And then some. Thank you so much. Leandro.
Hi, Loretta. Thank you for being here. I really admire your work. Uh, Kelly gave us one of your readings for the Calling In and Calling Out, which was published in the New York Times. But I really resonated with one of your quotes where you say that when you're asking somebody to give up hate, and in order, if you want to be there for them, you really have to open up if you really want them to give up hate. Uh, Tell us more about how you came about, because that's a very powerful quote, and I really resonated with that, especially just thinking back about the whole Black Lives Matter movement, and a lot of cancel culture that was happening, and kind of seeing that. Uh, that was quite brilliant. So yeah, thank
I
you.
wish I could say I was that smart, but that was not my quote. My boss, Reverend C.T. Vivian, is the one who said that to me. And y'all don't know CT because he wasn't assassinated, because of course he's been more famous. But if you've watched any civil rights film like Eyes on the Prize or something, he's the one that's wagging his finger in Bull Connor's face saying, "You can beat me back, but you can't beat back freedom," kind of thing. But when we started our work deprogramming white supremacists, Reverend Vivian used to always tell us that if you ask people to give up hate, then you need to be there for them when they do. And the first time he said that, I said, "Oh shit." But I had to say it under my breath because you can't curse at a preacher, right? So I just mumbled it. But I was like, this man is crazy. Because if the Klan hates me, I'm all right hating them back. I frankly think that's the way it's supposed to be. But then I started talking to these ex-white supremacists, these ex-anti-abortionists, these you know, Klansmen, these ex whatever they were forsaking and giving up. And I found that once I got to know them, I couldn't hate them. And so that's when I learned to ask them about their journeys, what made them land at where they were, and what caused their epiphanies, what caused them to change. I find that a lot of people don't think deeply about what they believe in. They can be acculturated into it. They can, they receive an overly simplified analysis that makes sense. See, the world is a real complicated place. And most people are so busy just surviving that they don't spend a lot of time thinking about why they believe what they believe. It's usually someone they trust who shares their beliefs with them, and those are the beliefs that they adopt, that they ingest themselves. They don't quite often interrogate them for themselves. And so that's why we have to take the time to talk to them, to find out what their pathways were to those beliefs. And generally, ask them some basic questions without telling them what to believe. That's what you thought then. What do you think now? What do you think about what you thought about back then? How are you going to do something differently in the future? How would you like to be seen? You know, what is your inner opinion of yourself as a good person, and how would you like to manifest that in the world? Those are the kinds of conversations we'd have. We're not trying to provide any answers or anything, and certainly most people caught up in those kind of situations have already been brainwashed quite a bit, so we don't want to do anything that appears to be furthering a brainwashing just from the other side. We want them to think for themselves, so that they can develop a belief system that they can live with. that makes them feel like their inner goodness is aligned with their outer behaviors. But it was Reverend Vivian who originally said that. I wish I could take credit for it, but I ain't that smart. I just had to implement it.
Thank you. Leandro, do you have anything else?
Thank you.
Samir wants to hear a story. Samir, you wanna ask Professor Ross yourself? She said, tell us about the uncle story you shared in the TED Talk.
Oh, okay. I have an Uncle Frank, but I need to confess he's neither my uncle nor is he named Frank. He's actually a relative that I can't name because he's still alive and I don't want to out him, nationally. But this Uncle Frank always came to family gatherings and needed attention. And one way that he would always seek to get attention was to say something horrible about somebody that wasn't there, but not in a gossip about the family kind of way. I mean, because we did all of that at the family reunion, but it was usually attacking somebody, a race or a class of people who weren't there. One year I'll come, oh, they should have kicked all those women off welfare. They just laying on their asses and opening their legs up for everybody. That kind of comment. But the one that got on my nerves. I'm from San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio is 60% Mexican American, 20% white, 20% Black. And Black people in San Antonio were used, particularly in the 50s and 60s, as the buffer group to keep Mexican Americans out of the economy. And so growing up Black in San Antonio meant that you learned a lot of anti-Mexican hatred and biases and stuff, because it was expected of you in order to get a job in San Antonio. So my uncle came to this particular family reunion in 1980 and started talking about the Mexican Americans that he had to supervise because he worked in the water treatment plant for the city. And he said all these awful things. And usually when he said these kind of things, I'd be the human rights activist that run in there and fight with them and, just start debating with them and blah, blah, blah. And this particular time, and this was before I learned anything about calling in or anything, I decided to try something different. And I happen to know this person very well. As a matter of fact, I happen to love this person a lot. And so I said to them, I know you and I love you. And what I know about you is that you'd run into a burning building and save somebody if you could, and you wouldn't care whether they were Mexican or white or Black or gay or straight. I know that about you. So, Uncle Frank, how am I supposed to reconcile the good Uncle Frank I know you are with the words that just came out of your mouth? Because I don't know if I got a good Uncle Frank or a bad Uncle Frank. With that tactic, what I was doing, now that I can now analyze it, years after the fact, was that I wasn't calling him in or out. I was calling on him to tell me which Uncle Frank I had. I had also assured him of my love. And I kept repeating his name so he could remember that I'm centering our relationship in this conversation. And at the same time, I was modeling for the rest of my family how to talk to Uncle Frank without turning over the damn table. And so I find that I can use that calling on tactic much more now than I knew. I mean, in 1980, I didn't know anything. I was, 27 years old. I was heading up the Rape Crisis Center at the time, but I didn't know that what I was doing was a calling on tactic. I've only learned to name it that much later. But what was interesting about that outcome was that after that conversation, Uncle Frank never answered my question. But after that conversation, he never said those things in my presence again. And so he may still have thought them, but he stopped coming to the family reunion and blowing it up with his racism and bigotry, which made me like him even more and stuff. So I don't know if I could change him. I don't think any of us have the magic words to change another human being. I mean, if we could do that, couples wouldn't fight. I mean, co-workers wouldn't fight. But we do have the opportunity to offer attentive listening, respect, and love, and ask them to change themselves, ask them to think about how they want to be seen in the world. Because quite often people don't stop to think about that until somebody asks them to. So that's my Uncle Frank's story.
That is a good story. Hell.
And I think many of us have Uncle Franks in our families, you know, or maybe more than one. And yet we can't get away with them because they're family. And we do worry about the impact they'll have on more impressionable family members. And so learning to talk to them by reassuring them of our relationship and at the same time calling attention to what they need to do better is a classic calling on strategy. There was someone named L who had a question.
Yes,
Okay.
Professor, I can't tell you, I've been having constant goosebumps since I got on this call. So thank you so much for this, for your intervention today. I, by way of where I'm coming from in this following question, I am an LGBT activist from the Middle East and North Africa. I'm now, I'm now an American citizen, live here in the United States, but I'm pretty involved in the activism in the Middle East and North Africa around LGBT issues. And I find myself oftentimes siloed because I refuse to engage in reverse bigotry against people who, hate LGBT people. And I've experienced it at home. The way I've, my parents moved from wanting to call the police on me and take me to jail to being the pride of their life now. And it's a process, right? And I never fought this back, their hatred or their fear, because I think it's fear mostly, with more aggression. I just, embrace them. But on the activist side, I mean, you can do that with your parents. You could argue that, your parents are gonna just, come around. That's not true to everybody, but you have that. But what about activists? I keep being called out for not being too harsh in my approach. I've personally been attacked because I also want to hold the movement accountable to not engage in this kind of behavior that's not constructive and not helpful. And I was wondering if your concept, is it taking traction? How can we find each other, activists who do want to do meaningful change without, burning the pot? How do we find each other? Because the first time I heard about this was in Kelly Bear's class, where she got us to read your article, and I've been sharing it everywhere in the activist world. But how do we find each other? Because that's certainly not something easy to do. By doing that, you are also going to be called out and probably harassed for calling people in.
Oh yeah, I get it all the time. First thing I try to do is explain to people the appropriate use of calling out, because I'm not just totally taking it off the table. There are appropriate times we need to call people out: when people abuse their power over somebody else, when they're lying or not operating in good faith, when they are committing further harm because nobody has called them out, that kind of thing. That's what the human rights movement does. We call out individuals, we call out governments, we call out corporations for their abuse of other people. But what people don't understand, and this is what I explained, is that as a human rights activist, that's not our tactic of first resort, it's our tactic of last resort. Because first we're going to try to talk to them. We're going to try to, work out conflict resolution with them. We're going to try a whole lot of other things before we get to the public calling out and shaming. The problem with the call out culture is that people use that first. So they foreclose any opportunity to have a conversation because they're too busy calling each other out. And so that's one thing. The second thing I talk about when people call me out for calling people in is my analysis of what we're up against. I think the people who are opposed to human rights think they're fighting us, but I don't believe they're fighting us. I think they're fighting forces that are much bigger than all of us because they're fighting truth. They're fighting history and they're fighting time. And truth, history, and time is going to kick their asses. I'm sorry, even if we don't. But my biggest fear, as I've said before, is that with the call out culture, we'll self-destruct on the way to victory. Because time doesn't need our help. The truth does need our help. Evidence and history, well, we're fighting over which history right now. But with all of those things arrayed on our side, I'm concerned that we will not, well, what we will do is, like they say in sports, snatch defeat from the jaws of victory with the call out culture. As we turn on each other, as we cannibalize each other, instead of staying focused on people who are opposed to human rights altogether. And I see it over and over again. I think that some call outs are done because people are hurting. I think some call outs are done because people feel the need for attention. I think they're trying to signal how woke they are, how virtuous they are. So it's virtue signaling. I think that there's too many people who don't get sufficient positive affirmations in their lives, and so they use the call out culture as a way to get that ephemeral approvals by how many people like what they say or share what they say on social media and things like that. And I think a lot of it is driven by a feeling of accountability. This is the best way to hold people accountable for what they've done. But it is like the least effective way to hold people accountable, because once you call somebody out, most of the time they're going to harden their position. They're going to double down because you just shamed and embarrassed them. So why would they suddenly agree with you when you just made them feel worse about themselves? Kind of thing. Very human people enjoy feeling worse about themselves unless they need deep, intense therapy. And so when you call people in, you're choosing to acknowledge their humanity, acknowledge their right to have a different point of view, and also invite them into a conversation about the differing points of view. But you also acknowledge that we're all in this together as human beings, sharing a planet, sharing a country, sharing a community, and sharing a neighborhood. When people really disagree with me and can't seem to get over the words that I use or the words that they use, I tend to go underneath their words and ask them about values. Like, okay, you don't agree that defund the police is a good idea, for example. So let's switch topics. What would you think is necessary for us to have a safe community so my kids can go to school without getting shot? What do you think a child deserves in order to be in the best frame of mind to get an education? Those kinds of value-driven conversations can reveal common ground that opponents don't necessarily think that they had. For example, I got a lot of call outs because I edited an anthology called Radical Reproductive Justice. And I put out a call for papers inviting anyone who wanted to write on the topic of reproductive justice to submit an essay for my anthology. And I received this one essay from a woman named Mary Crane Dare, who was president of Feminists for Life at the time. And so my editorial committee I was working with wanted us to reject her essay out of hand because she didn't come in as a pro-choice advocate. And yet, when I subjected her essay to the criteria that we had put out there, she did exactly what we asked her to do: show how reproductive justice shows up in your work. She answered that question brilliantly, not always honestly, but brilliantly. But then, there were 40 essays and I disagreed with about 10 of them. So, that's no big deal. And so I fought my editorial committee and included Mary's essay in the anthology because I wanted to show that someone who represents the pro-life movement can actually talk about 2 of the 3 tenets: the right to birth, the right to birth under the conditions you want, and what happens to the children once they're born, kind of thing, even if we disagreed over the right to abortion. And so I got called out for that. But I thought that it would not be right to exclude that essay when I could point to 9 others I disagreed with too. And I didn't exclude them as well. And so I didn't want to exclude essays based on criteria that hadn't been shared or used in the call for papers and stuff like that. And so, yeah, there's a tendency of people to call me too accommodating too. Because there's a whole lot of people that say, why the hell did you put that in this book? I said, well, you really don't know, but there were 2 other essays in there by pro-life writers, but they didn't come out as pro-life, so you didn't even notice them. You just noticed the one that came out as pro-life because I was showing the flexibility, the capaciousness of the reproductive justice framework, how universally applicable it is and how adaptable it is. That was the point of the book and stuff. And so I get called out all the time, but mostly because I do shit wrong. And then sometimes just people don't like what I stand for and what I say and what I believe.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to do a follow-up and say this is so true. And I was chatting with Kelly moments earlier that sometimes we do practice calling in certain spaces, but not in others. And I think it's important to listen to that. And I wanted to share with everyone that not only my parents accepted me in the end, like my mom got on the radio last year calling people on to do better and respect people's humanity when there was a huge wave of anti-LGBT stuff. And I was just so proud. She, recorded it and sent it to me. And she told me, I know you're not in Lebanon, but, I made sure that your voice is heard. So these things work. It's just how do we make them work, and how do we talk about them so that people have the courage to stand up is so important.
Well, I had a similar situation with my mom, though I swear, I think my mother would have preferred me to come out as queer than as an abortion rights activist, because she was, Southern Baptist evangelical, where she thought birth control was clean to the Bible, in your hands or between your knees. Either way, you wouldn't have sex outside of marriage kind of person. And and not to mention anything about people being gay, that was just not even up for discussion. But early in the AIDS crisis, one of my cousins, who had been deeply closeted, he even got married to disguise that he was gay and had kids. came down with AIDS in 1989. And Frank, my God, his name actually is Frank. I'm using that name. But cousin Frank was one of my mother's favorite nephews. And watching what Frank went through touched my mother in a way I'm sure all of my polemics could not have done. Next thing I know, my mother was defending Frank. You would have thought she had created PFLAG, because for her, his sexual orientation had nothing to do with the fact that he was family. And you stood up for family. She was hell on standing up for family. That was my mother's deepest held value beyond her religion. And so she became a fierce advocate in her own way for gay rights because of the AIDS crisis. Surprised the hell out of me. And then I got in trouble one time. Oh my God, I got in trouble. I have a niece. I have 37 nieces and nephews because we got a big family, 8 kids and on and on. Anyway, I have a niece who's in her 50s now. And all I ever knew about her in the infrequent times that we saw each other is that she was with her girlfriend. And, you know, coming to the family reunions together and stuff like that. So I imagined myself as the safe aunt that she could come out to, right? So one time in front of her mother, I asked so-and-so, when you and so-and-so gonna get married? And she said, oh, Loretta, what are you talking about? I said, you and your friend, y'all have been together for 30 years. I mean, when y'all gonna get married? She said, Loretta, I ain't queer. I'm not a lesbian and neither is she. We're just BSS, we're just best friends. And her mother turned to her and said, is there something you haven't told me? I was so embarrassed because I had assumed that my niece, whose girlfriend I knew as well as I knew her because they were always together, was her lover, and it was not. You know? And so we make these mistakes all the time. I mean, I just, you know, I keep saying, all you can do is try to tell your truth and then learn new truths as you go along.
I love that. Can I ask a sort of, I guess, bi-directional question? If stick with me for a second. So much of what you're talking about involves, I think, a lot of one-on-one, even if you have an audience, like to Kate's question, how do we answer in public, right? But you're still speaking to one individual in the moment. And the ethos of calling in is this kind of relationship building tool. And I'm also hearing that your work, and I want to know whether whether I've got this right, you're willing to go into spaces where other people might not go, to meet people, to cross boundaries, right? You know, you famously, you know, go to Klan rallies, whatever, right? Like are you telling us we need to be willing to get up out of our chairs and go places and connect with people and do more of that? So that's kind of one. Like, talk to me about the sort of, you know, what in reporting, I'm a journalist, you would call shoe leather, right? Like getting out there and finding people where they are and connecting if you want to really build a relationship and move someone in the way that Elle's mom moved or your mother moved, right? But then related, for those of us and the folks, some of the folks in the room are doing like a campaign, right? Like a messaging project where how can we capture the calling in ethos in communications that are not being delivered straight from our mouths, in our literature, in a tweet, you know, like, what can we do to kind of build that feeling and that energy? Because you were also talking about the capaciousness of the reproductive justice framework. Like, you've got a brilliant framework, right? So this is a complicated question, but I'm hearing like a lot of this work is like one-on-one, and then there are times when we need to do more mass communications. What can we do in that realm to shift the culture in the direction Elle is talking about and normalizing this way of being with each other?
In my classes, I teach about the different roles people play in the calling in culture. Sometimes you are the person calling someone in. Sometimes you're the bystander or the fact finder or the bridge builder Or, there's like 13 to 15 different roles you can play that will be useful in the calling in culture. And the goal is not to pass judgment on which role somebody chooses to play at any given moment, because you don't know what's going on with them. They might not have the emotional energy to take on somebody, but they may be the fact finder or the truth seeker or the healer who helps hold somebody's heart in their hand so that it doesn't get bruised. There's a number of different roles you can play in a calling in culture. So there's that. The thing to do is respect where people are and offer them a chance to see things differently, but don't insist that they do, and don't judge them for not doing it, because they're entitled to their opinions just like you're entitled to your opinion, as long as they recognize that their opinions are not facts. Because you don't get to debate whether gravity exists, for example. Because at that point, I'm gonna invite you to jump out of a window and see if you fly. But generally speaking, you know, we can all have different opinions on things. Now, when I'm talking to people less directly, I tend to moderate the register that I use. I tend to avoid what I call our 90% language, our ultra leftist language that talks about heteropatriarchy and neoliberal capitalism and blah, 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 blah. Because when you use those kinds of words, you're either using them among people who already know what they mean, or you're basically condescending and talking down to people. And that is not a good communication register. And so I tend to reframe my concepts in a way that is legible to them. So for example, if I'm talking to someone who does humanitarian work, feeding the hungry, I'm not going to batter them over the head with an analysis of why there's poverty in the richest country in the world, blah, 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 which I certainly could do. But I will say, well, you are a humanitarian and you feed the hungry. And as a human rights activist, my job is to figure out why they're hungry in the first place. I share your values, but I'm working on them in a different way. My father, before he died, invited me to talk to his American Legion. My dad was a lifer. He was in the military for over 26 years. And so he was in the Veterans of Foreign Wars, American Legion, all National Rifle Association, all the things, that a good American patriot joins, right? And so he invited me to talk to his American Legion people about health care for veterans once they needed to be in a nursing home. And what had happened was that, unbeknownst to most veterans, the government privatized the nursing home system after promising these soldiers that if you spent 20 years in the Army, the Navy, the Marines, or whatever, you would have health care for life. The government reneged on that deal. Okay, meaning that when a elderly veteran needed to be placed in a nursing home, whoever they were living with or whatever their family was, whoever they filed taxes with, had to destitute themselves in order to be eligible for the government to pay for their nursing home. So basically, what it meant was that the home that my mom and dad had finally bought after he retired from the Army, mom would have had to sell the house and impoverish herself in order for dad to be eligible for government support to be in a nursing home. That's what I'm calling about reneging, right? Because that was not part of the deal for which my dad got shot up 3 separate wars for, right? And so I had to talk to those American Legion veterans in that register, not talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and what's wrong with America and da da da. They don't want to hear that shit. You got to say the Pledge of Allegiance before you can even start the conversation, which I'm willing to do. So you talk to people in the register that makes the most sense for them. even as you convey your values as honestly as you can, kind of thing. I love going into pro-life meetings because they have theories about giving babies up for abortion, for adoption. I have the lived experience of not being able to. So they need to hear from people like me.
So quick follow-up to that. I want to be really mindful of time, but you know, a lot of us are sort of isolated or get in our bubbles, right? So do you think, I mean, whether, you know, there's racial segregation, you know, there's white isolation. I mean, I'm, you know, there's echo chambers, right? So do you think that structural, sociological ways we've divided ourselves, right, make it harder for the average person to connect with people who are not like them?
Yeah, I mean, there's been so much written over the monetization of these bubbles by the social media platforms, of course, there is, and the collapse of our institutions where we would historically get engaged in. Like I grew up in the Girl Scouts and the American Legion and the VFW culture, where we knew each other, we met each other, churches, whatever. And there's a collapse of those kinds of civil society institutions that's providing fewer and fewer opportunities for people to naturally congregate and share information and share perspectives. So yes, some of the isolation is structural, but I'm watching the young people and they don't feel isolated for the most part. They don't feel disconnected just because they can't go trick-or-treating anymore. They're finding ways through TikTok and through meetups and other kinds of ways of achieving the same kind of social connection that we used to do through in-person stuff. And so I'm not going to quickly say that what worked in the 1950s and 60s should be what we use now because it's just not appropriate. And so I don't devalue how young people and people who are into social media are connecting now, even though it's barely recognizable to a boomer like me. But I live a lot with young people. I hang out with young people. Every year I let interns stay with me who are like 19, 20, and 21 so that they can intern at an organization and stuff. I provide free housing. They teach me as much as I ever can teach them about the world that they occupy and the thinking that they do and how they build community in a way that I wouldn't necessarily recognize. And so I appreciate every generation gets to decide the struggle on their own terms because they're dealing with different material conditions than the previous generation dealt with. But that's why our struggle has to be intergenerational as well as interracial and inter-identity, because no one generation or no one identity has all the answers that we need. We need everybody participating in this human rights movement. I was on another interview on NPR earlier today, and I had written this article about how necessary it is for white women to be on the front lines of the abortion debate because it's white wounds that are basically being fought over. I mean, the people who are the architects of this anti-abortion stuff, I don't think they necessarily want more Black and brown babies to be born because there's too many of us getting killed. So I think it's about the commodification of white wounds. And occasionally they're blurted out, they'll tell that inconvenient truth. And so the point of my article was that it's totally appropriate for white women to be the face of the abortion rights movement because it's white wounds that are the target. Now, women of color are collateral damage. I get that. Trans people are collateral damage, but that doesn't mean we're the targets and stuff. And so, and that was in response to a fairly strong belief, particularly among Black women, that they blame the whiteness of the movement for the overturning of Roe. They basically say if the movement hadn't been so white, it wouldn't have been so vulnerable and Roe wouldn't have been overturned. I think that is an overly simplistic analysis. And so I felt as a longtime activist, I needed to speak up about what I see as the real racial politics of the attack on abortion, birth control, and sex education, as opposed to this the racial analysis that they were taking.
This was the Yes piece, right? The Yes magazine piece.
Yes.
Yeah, I shared that with all the USF folks, so they've all got that, and it's a brilliant piece. And so what show are you going to? What was the NPR interview already broadcast? Sorry.
No, it's going to be on the NPR in San Francisco over the next couple of days because the reporter was calling me from San Francisco, 415 area code.
Awesome. Well,
so I'm sure it'll be on y'all's air in a while.
Sort of where we are. Yeah, I sent it to, I sent it to, I can send it along or whatever. I sent it to our two classes, I believe. I think it was on and I put it in the Google group. I sent it to the whole community a couple ways. But anyway, I don't want to take too much more of anybody's time. I'm sitting here thinking about the young people thing. I'm thinking, how can I get some teenagers in our master's degree program? So I'm going to work on that. But
teenagers in the master's, you're looking for the world's prodigies or something? Don't they have to graduate high school and get a grad first?
I'm kidding. I have some teenagers at home. I'll just see if I can find a way to, connect the dots. But I appreciate that so much.
Not
and I
appreciate put the master's program on TikTok.
Exactly. And as Dave said, yes, it took the identity theft by Chinese operatives to bring us together. Dave is always good for that kind of joke. Does anybody have, we're really long on time. I don't want to hold anybody. Does anybody have one more burning question or any final comments? Or Loretta would
hear from people who haven't spoken up yet.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Not to put anybody on the spot, but there are some other voices I'd like to hear from.
Hi, Loretta. I think Kelly shared, I'm in her capstone class, so I'm working on the access to doulas for active duty women, and then particularly focus on how the policies they've put in place are really detrimental to culturally competent care. And so just that, but going back to the human rights, the first time I heard that was through talking with a birth network that I'm part of, and when COVID happened and the issues that women were having, we have a lot of issues in the birth space within the system to begin with, but with COVID, and then women going into the birth space, particularly in hospitals, and having to do X, Y, and Z, or having to wear a mask, or not being able to have anybody and being alone, and we saw, cases of trauma and obstetric violence increase through that. And it was the first time I ever heard of this concept of those human rights that you talked about, and really tying those into the birth space, and with what our rights are within a birth space. So I just wanted to say that. And so I definitely appreciate you bringing that up. I think it's so important, particularly for someone who has experienced birth trauma, and I know there are millions upon millions of people out there that have. But to say that, I think it's so important for us to talk about. And I didn't realize that we were the only nation that didn't talk about human rights in school. And so now this is something I'm going to highlight with my kiddos at home. But thank you so much for that, and for allowing me an opportunity to tie in your work into the birth world, even more than it already is.
Well, I know that my own pregnancy experience would have been much easier if I'd had a doula by my side, because there's no, I was in a Salvation Army home for unwed mothers, and where my mother and father had stuck me because we were supposed to give the baby up for adoption, and me return back to school pretending I'd been on a long vacation. And when I made the decision to keep my son, that all changed. But because it was run by the Salvation Army, they didn't do anything to teach us about why we 30 girls who were pregnant, they didn't teach us about what birthing was going to be like, what the pregnancy was going to be. They actually they actually acted as if talking about what had happened to us was the sin itself, and so they were so silent over everything. And so I spent months in this home for unwed mothers, and nobody ever talked to me about, this is what delivery is going to be like. These are the changes your body's going through. None of that was available to us. And we just got reassured that if we kept praying, we would eventually, and gave the babies away, we'd eventually become good girls again. And that was said to us almost daily in one form or another. And so, God, I'm glad those homes for unwed girls don't exist anymore. But doulas and midwives should be part of everybody's pregnancy experience, because your fears of what you don't know will affect the pregnancy outcome.
Yes, absolutely. And there's so much that we don't get told in our prenatal care to begin with, particularly when you're looking at the system, and how, it's meant to be a convenience in many ways. And, there are really great providers out there, but for us here in the United States to not have a standard of midwifery care like most other developed nations is really astonishing. And to have the highest maternal mortality rate of a developed world, like, it doesn't make any sense to me, and I this one here, I had her at home, and I felt more safe at home with my midwife than I ever did in my 2 previous hospital births. And that's not to say, and that hospitals are bad. There's a reason that they exist, and there's a reason we have all these interventions, and we do save birthing people and we do save babies. But for that to be the standard of care, that's standard for everybody, when it doesn't have to be. And no one tells you, like, oh, like, let's talk about different pain management techniques, instead of, did you know the epidural does X, Y, and Z? Nobody tells you that.
Yeah.
You have doulas.
I had a very painful conversation with a woman who is pregnant, who's also undergoing cancer treatment. And she just got diagnosed with the cancer a month ago, and she's 6 months pregnant. And she is deeply concerned that with the reversal of Roe, that the physicians that she's dealing with will prioritize saving the fetus over saving her life. So she's in Georgia, so she's really thinking about leaving this state so that she can find physicians that she's sure will see her life as important.
Wow. It's unbelievable.
So these are the things that are happening as a consequence, where women are having to do very desperate things that they shouldn't have to do. It is their human right to control their bodies. I mean, I was telling somebody, I said, when you are forced to give your body up for the enrichment of the well-being of somebody else, that fits almost every definition of slavery I've heard. And the women shouldn't be put in that position. It should be a joy to have a baby, to give your life up. I know once I made the decision to keep my son, he became the center of my world. I'm still around because of him. But it was my decision. It was my decision. If it had not been my decision, because when a child is born out of these complicated incest, rape things, you love the child, but you hate their circumstances. Where every child should have, uncontested love from their parent, right? And so if I hadn't had the support system I had from my mom and dad co-parenting with me, I am convinced my son would have been the target of all the rage I had for what had happened to me. Because they had to actively intervene to keep that rage from becoming the dominant feeling I expressed towards my son. Because I was a baby raising a baby. And my son and I, we're very lucky that we had my parents. My mother who had raised 8 kids, she knew what she was doing. But a lot of people don't have that kind of familial support when they're a teen mother and stuff. And the pregnancy happened under, because most teenagers are impregnated by men much older than them anyway. So by definition, they're victims of childhood sexual abuse. And it's impossible for that trauma not to be visited on how they parent without having a great support system.
Right. Right. Anybody else?
Anybody else want to speak up? Let's be quiet.
I've held my seat for a while. First, thank you. It has been my whole delight to make your acquaintance and to hear your words of wisdom. I appreciate all that you've offered, and I'm taking all the fruits that I can carry from this conversation. Well, thank you for that. It's entirely possible that I just missed where the Nazi ended up in his journey.
Floyd Cochran?
Are you two still in communication? Is he no longer with them? What's that status? And
Floyd went on to start an organization called Education and Vigilance because he wanted to dissuade other alienated kids who came out of situations like he came out of from joining the Nazi movement. And he felt personally responsible because he recruited these 2 kids named Freeman to the Aryan nations. And within months of Floyd recruiting them in Allentown, Pennsylvania, they came home and murdered their entire family. The Freeman family, Allentown, Pennsylvania, you can Google it. And Floyd felt personally guilty over that because he remembered talking to the Freeman kids at 15 and 17, and they turned on their family. And so he started Education and Vigilance as a way to pay back, to reverse what he had done. But one thing I could say about a lot of these people that join the white supremacists, they ain't really good at having their act together, right? That's how they're drawn to these organizations in many ways. And so Floyd and his wife ended up separating, and then I think he got into isolation. I'm not sure if he was doing, I never had any history of him doing drugs or anything, but he did drink coffee like it was like, a life. I've never seen anybody drink 10, 12 cups of coffee a day, and he did. And that kind of thing. And so just last year, a reporter following up with him put us back in touch with each other after we had not been in touch for well over 15 years. So I got an update on how he's doing. But I mean, when you work with these people, they're not necessarily going to become your best friends. There was one funny story, and I'll close with this. Our story was in the LA Times. So if you put Loretta Ross and Floyd Cochran, you can Google the story. But anyway, somebody wrote, a reporter in the LA Times wrote up our story, and then someone who wrote screenplays for HBO contacted us and did what they call an option. They paid each of us $10,000 for the rights to our story. And they were going to develop an HBO type movie about the Black woman who helped the ex-Nazi kind of thing. But when they sent us the script, they said they had written that Floyd had left the Nazis because he fell in love with a Black woman. Totally not the truth, right? Totally not the truth. And I was like, of course, I understand Hollywood needs to, but frankly, our truth is good enough to sell this movie. We don't have to pretend that there was this romantic interest. And so when I rejected the script, I wrote the screenwriter. I said, first of all, I'm going around falling in love with Nazis. I mean, I certainly don't fall in love with Nazis that are the size of my thigh.
Lord.
what am I going to do? Fall in love with somebody that makes me feel even fatter than I am? I mean, what the hell?
Oh, Lord.
And he's married. I mean, it's like all the things, all the reasons that they shouldn't have written the script that way.
That's right. Wow.
And I'm going to be the home wrecker of the Nazis. I mean, what are you talking about? And so we both turned down the script, because Floyd for his reasons, me for mine, so it never got produced.
Interesting. Okay.
But
Thank
I
you for that. I
thought
appreciate
that was a funny ending to the story.
It's a wonderful way to end, and I would love to end, but also Amanda put one more question in the chat. If you don't mind addressing it, do you see it here? Amanda, do you want to say it out loud?
Sure. I know. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you all for your great comments too. I just wanted to say I loved your article, and yes, and I've been thinking a ton about it, but I want to know how you think white women can realistically take the lead when over so many years take the lead in fighting for abortion rights and fighting for reproductive justice, when everything I've read for so many years has said that one of the largest criticisms of the women's rights movement was that white women weren't inclusive, going back to the 60s or going back even further to the suffragettes, that they were not inclusive in their social movement. So it seems like how do we do that realistically? Does that make sense within the current milieu?
I'm, as one of those Black women who offered those criticisms for 50 years, we
Right,
demand
and I
that
think
your
justifiably,
analysis,
absolutely.
we demand that your analysis is intersectional, first of all. Because frankly, my biggest criticism of white women isn't the lack of inclusion of women of color. It's not even conquering the class issues among white women. If Norma McCorvey, who was the original Jane Roe, had been embraced by the movement, they could have taught themselves how the hell to deal with low-income white women and not leave them to be organized by the people opposed to abortion. You know, that's my critique of white women. They don't even understand how to live appropriately in a white skin. How the hell would I ever expect them to understand the reality of a Black woman? You know, so I think people get part of our message right and a good portion of it wrong, because they go for representational inclusion. Let's have a diverse photo op without a substantive transformation of what we think and how we act on what we think. You know, and that's what I've always demanded, that if you understand how to occupy a white skin and rebuff the ideology of white supremacy without feeling guilty about being white, you would be the best ally a Black person could ever ask for. Because then you're coming to the movement not expecting us to take care of your fragility, not expecting us to do the work only you can do in white communities, kind of thing. This is what we need.
Well,
So when we talk about inclusiveness, we're talking about ideological inclusiveness, but we still have separate roles, different roles we need to play. Because it's the same way as a football team. They have a strategy to win a game, but the quarterback can't have the same role as the linebacker, as the running back. You know, you play different roles, but you're still on the same team.
And we have some training we need to do, is what I'm hearing you say. We need to get out on the field and do our internal calisthenics and work on ourselves, is what I'm hearing.
Right, but a lot of white women think you're supposed to speak up for Black women or speak up for trans women. No, that's the savior thing. If you learn to speak up from a perspective as a white woman with an intersectional analysis, particularly to deal with why the term white trash is so scary for white people, you would bring so much more to the movement than has ever been brought before.
Thank you, Amanda, for that question. And thank you, Loretta, for that answer. And thank you, all of you, for being here. It is such a joy. I'm so happy to have had this time with you. I'm so grateful for your wisdom, Loretta. It's been a dream to have you speak with some of my students and friends, and tonight it came true. So thank you.
Well, thank y'all. I look forward to working with y'all in the future.
We'll be in
Bye-bye.
touch. Everybody be well. If any students have questions for me, if you want to hang out for a minute, I understand if you're just done, you know where to find me, but I can hang out for about one more minute, though my dad is freaking out because he wants to start the grill for dinner. But he can do that. He keeps opening the door like, what are you doing? Anybody need anything? Isn't she fabulous? I just love her.
This was incredible, Kelly. Thank you.
And thanks for being here. It's like we closed the loop here from.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much for being here and being part of it. I'll make the video available to everybody if you want it. I don't know. Yeah. I was writing as fast as I could. She has just like, I mean, everything that comes out of her mouth is, I just want forever. And I can't, look at this. Ricardo's got notes. Everybody's got notes. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I have like 6 pages, but I still want to print out the transcript. So when you send us the video, we can actually pull out the transcript, and it needs to be like a lesson. Oh my God, this is great. Thank you.
Kelly,
Sure.
calm
Yeah.
down. I gotta drop.
Okay, I think I can send along the transcript. I'll send the recording and the transcript. And those of you who forewent a normal class session tonight, like I said, just grab me if you need me. I'll see you next week as scheduled. I'll see you on Canvas. Bye, Elle. Bye, everybody. Yeah, you can watch Loretta on YouTube. You can have Loretta in your living room. And Leanne, I wanted to grab her. And Paloma, I'm so glad your son listened. That makes me so happy. So. All right, guys, I will see you next week, okay? All right, take it easy. Bye.